So this is lecture 2 in the Western peace traditions. I'm going to focus on the Jewish tradition and Shalom, which is just the Jewish word for peace itself. Unfortunately, in modern education, the whole Jewish tradition has virtually vanished, even though it continues to play a significant role in elements of Christianity and Christian Zionism. But at public universities, that tradition is very rarely taught. You'll find elements of it obviously taught in seminaries, Bible schools, synagogues, whatever. But most people, when they come out of, sadly so, modern education, most are trained with a technical skill, whether it's computer skills or whether it's business, sciences, various technical skills, and so they graduate with BAs, but really they're not educated in any significant sense. And then we move on to the humanities, which was often the bear and the bastion of these great epic stories, cultural histories, Western civilization, because of a liberal notion, a Hegelian notion of history as progress. Then the past is often distorted or caricatured in the telling. And so it leaves people quite bereft of any understanding of how the past contributes in a conversation to the present in terms of peacemaking, peacekeeping, and ideas that are so important in terms of public life. The other dilemma we face is in a language of multiculturalism. The positive side, obviously, multiculturalism is that various ethnic people coming from different difficult military, political, economic conditions are welcomed into a rather affluent America, Euro-America tradition. The downside of that is that in multiculturalism, very few people know anything about their heritages or history or tradition in any significant sense. So people who have some minimal understanding of multiculturalism, they have a thin knowledge of everything and a substantive knowledge of nothing. And so this contributes to a real dilemma when trying to understand other heritages, ethnic backgrounds, historic peoples that have substantively contributed to the Western ethos itself. And so there are a variety of problems we have, really part of the contribution of progressive liberalism that's led to memoricide, essentially, and people have no memory of anything. We do know if we were to go to bed at night, put our head in the pillow and wake up in the morning with no memory, we wouldn't know how to orient very well. Well, it's the same with a civilization and a culture. When it has no memory, how does a person orient both personally, context of family, communities, or obviously nations and civilizations where there is no memory, there are no landmarks, there is no compass, there is no North Star. And so we face a real dilemma culturally with the reality of memoricide, the destroying of all foundations. And then when we come to important issues, in this case, peace, what do we mean by peace, and how have different cultures in the past and in the present tried to make sense of that? Well, the Jewish tradition is just a part of Western civilization. As I mentioned, historically, what has often happened in universities when people get beyond just a technical education, which is, as I mentioned, really not education, it's just an information transfer, skill learning, and then people barter, truck, and trade their skill in the marketplace, and hopefully they make a few coppers to get them through life. But education in terms of humanities, there has been this split between a Greek or Roman tradition as it's fed into the West, and how Christianity absorbed that, synthesized it, and created Western civilization. But the Jewish tradition is often ignored within that, unless, of course, it's included in biblical studies, which, of course, the bulk of the Bible is the Jewish text. The Christian text, the New Testament, or the Apocrypha, is largely the Jewish heritage itself. But in the Jewish tradition, in peacemaking, obviously, your readings for the course in the Catholic peace tradition will be lingering a little longer than what this lecture can do, because it's just a micro lecture. But I want to touch on a few things in terms of that peace tradition to give you a sense of that Jewish heritage, both then and the relevance of that for now, because obviously the ethnic Jewish people continue to live. It's not like an Assyrian civilization or Babylonian or Medes and Persians, in the sense that that traditions to some degree vaporized, and they don't have a continuing relevance in terms of land and politics and people and actually international politics itself, given Israel, the Palestinians, Middle East, Muslim civilizations. And so that biblical tradition, whether overtly committed to within the Jewish tradition, within the Orthodox or secular Jews, at least they have the memory of it. There is the myth or the stories that inform the Jewish understanding of Israel, the Palestinians, how they make sense of themselves in the diaspora, or surrounded by largely conflicting Muslim civilizations of the Sunni or Shia variety. But I want to touch on just a few elements to give you a feel, at least a taste, or to whet your palate for. Obviously, there's three elements of the Jewish tradition. There's the classical phase, or what we would call the biblical phase. There is the diasporic phase after the Romans came in and they destroyed the temple and they essentially wiped out, for the most part, the Jewish population, what today we call Israel. The Jews were dispersed for thousands of years. And then by the 19th century, largely through a movement of Christian Zionism that emerged in the 17th, 18th century, you have this movement led by Theodor Herzl and many others, a return to what today we call Israel, and the whole political dilemma that is a part of that. So these three things I'm going to lightly touch on. Obviously, each of them we can go to greater depths and mine them in a much fuller way. So the biblical phase, which is in ways the foundation textual phase of Judaism, in Genesis, you get the whole story of the calling. So after you get past Genesis 12, it's the calling of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So you have within this Jewish tradition a sense that, particularly in their sacred tradition, not so much their secular, even though that lingers on in the secular as well, but they're a special people. They're a called people. God has chosen them, and a part of that chosenness is land itself. So by the time we get to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is really the bulk of Genesis, and then Joseph at the end of this. Joseph is a son. Some of you may have seen. There's been various dramas on Joseph, but the long and short of that story is he ends up in Egypt. Egypt was the great empire of the time. Pharaoh was the dominant, obviously, power broker in some of these empires of the time. But the Jews in this story, which is important to get post patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph becomes the leading figure in the Egyptian empire. And there's a whole backstory to Joseph's life, which if we had time, we'd go into. But over a period of time, the Jews proliferate in Egypt. They essentially become the drawers of wood and the hewers of water. They're an oppressed people, just as the blacks were in many ways in the States and any other oppressed people. The Jews know oppression. They know injustice. They know what it means to be animals almost doing slave labor for the Egyptians' imperial force and the terrible treatment. So one of their primary experiences is one of oppression and being treated brutally. And so they know in their skin and their pores what peace is and power is, but without justice. And this is important in the primal or the archetypal Jewish experiences. They have experienced in the Egyptian story or narrative or in their founding oppression. They know what it means to live in a country dominated by peace, but it's unjust peace, order controlled by a pharaonic dynasty in which the Egyptians were in power. And so the story of Exodus, the second great book after Genesis, in that story, Exodus is just two Greek words, ex, out, and hodos, out of the way. So it's the freedom story, freedom from slavery. And so within this particular story, of course, then the Jews gradually, under Moses' guidance, who was trained, he was raised in power, a power center within Egypt. And, of course, the many films that have been done on Moses, anyone who wants to get a sense of that. But whether you know it or not, the theme or the archetype is important to understand, in that he gradually liberates. So the language of liberation versus bondage is very much built into the Jewish soul. And they understand that. So they know oppression. They know what it's like. They know what power misused leads to in terms of them being treated unjustly. And so the whole Exodus, or the way out at a literal historic manner for the Jews, is their primary story. Oppression, freedom. And it's led by God, or in Hebrew it can be Jehovah or El Shaddai or Elohim. There's various Hebrew words for God that mean a little different things. But so when we think of peace, the primary Jewish collective experience beyond the patriarchs is one of peace and order without justice. So the question always is, what's the relationship of liberty and justice and peace and order within the Jewish psyche in that sense, given their historic experience, which was burned on the skin of their soul? And so Exodus is really that story about the liberation of the Jews, and of course the plagues that go on, the crossing the Red Sea. There's all sorts of second level stories here, but the underlying archetype or myth is liberating from unjust peace. Now, of course, what happens in Deuteronomy, which is the first big political manifesto that was long before Plato or Aristotle comes along, is the Jews are about to go into what their promised land, the land of milk and honey. Now, of course, there's people there, and this becomes a dilemma, because the Jews have understood oppression, power, them being the slaves, them being the victims of power, but they're now being told, God commands them, and this is always the important question when we read sometimes these sacred texts, is do you read them devotionally, so just believe God told the Jews to go into the promised land, but also being told to commit genocide. This is one of the first texts in Western civilization, a couple of chapters in Deuteronomy, which is just two Greek words, deuteros, second, or nomos, the second set of laws beyond the Ten Commandments, or the Decalogue. So they're being told, as it's interpreted by the text, that they are to go in, and people who are in that land, they are to wipe them out, men, women, children, animals. So it's genocide, really. And so, but they've also got in their background the Ten Commandments. You shouldn't kill. But they're being asked to kill. You shouldn't steal, but they're being asked to steal people's land. So you can't help but getting within this first 5 books of the Jewish narrative, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, cognitive dissonance will set in. So there's what we might call polyphony at work, the rise of Jewish nationalism, in which the very power that they were victims of at one point, they now are the ones in power, and they are repeating the Egyptian experience, except that they are now the pharaohs, and these other tribes in Canaan, in one sense, become the Jews. And now the Jews have the power. It's they see as a theocratic. God is running, telling them what to do. The question, but you also get in these first 5 books of the Jewish canon, remember that you were slaves, remember that you were oppressed, so don't be agents of oppressing others. So there's a variety of conflicting voices within the Hebrew canon, which is what we would call polyphony, poly for many, phonos in Greek for voice. And so this is a very important to reflect in terms of the Jewish peace tradition. Is peace about power? And peace is purchased at the price of who is the strongest, who has the strongest military. And if you throw God's commands in, then it seems to be you justify whatever you do. Or is there an alternate voice in the Jewish tradition that essentially says, Decalogue says you don't kill, you don't steal. Remember, you oppress, don't oppress others. Well, the very thing they're commanded not to do in the Decalogue, now they're commanded to do as they enter the Promised Land. And so out of this, you get 2 traditions emerging in the Jewish heritage in its primary documents. You get the nationalist tradition, very, very much at work, in which military, power, God, order all come together, and justice in many ways is subordinated. And so the very experience they had in Egypt, they're duplicating as they go into the... And they're using, of course, the language of God. Well, just as in Egypt, they would use exactly the same thing. The Pharaoh saw himself as the embodiment of the divine at a political level. And so this tension in Judaism, when it comes to peace, you get the prophetic tradition, which it's very strong on justice. and that peace is primarily defined by a concern for justice, just not the justice for us or the Jewish people or our people, but also justice in terms of how you treat the other in that sense. And Deuteronomy reflects on this, and it's a very conflicting text because on the one hand, there is a nationalist leaning, genocide, God commanding people to do things. It becomes their manifesto in many sense for their politics and how they run their emerging states and different tribes there. On the other hand, you get this prophetic side that says this is how you treat the foreigner, the outcast, the widower, animals, you name it. And so it has a very generous prophetic tradition. And so this is what we call polyphonic. There's various voices interpreting how they think God is speaking, and they collide and conflict. And so the question then always is in the Jewish tradition when it comes to peace, whose voice is the legitimate interpreter, in this case of God, or just the legitimate interpreter of how peace should be defined. And so the bulk of the Hebrew canon then really, it's a reflection on a dominant prophetic tradition, but also a significant imperial nationalist wing as well. And these constantly collide. If I had chance, for example, we'd look at two small, what are called the minor prophets, which are 12. We could look at the story of Jonah and his nationalist tendency, and he's told to care for the Assyrians, which would be the enemy at that time, just as in contemporary Middle East, they would see the Muslims as the enemy in Saudi Arabia or Iran or Iraq. If you just fast forward those sort of stories to today, they have a perennial ring. And Jonah has to work himself out of a nationalist understanding through a death and resurrection, and symbolically the whale. And then he has to go to the Assyrian people. Remember, the Jews were always living throughout the biblical narrative with empires surrounding them, beginning with the Egyptian, the Assyrian, Babylonian, Medes and Persians, and they're a small state, and they're always trying, do they assimilate into an empire? Do they resist the empire? In assimilating to an empire, do they lose their own heritage, their own history? It's a complex story, the biblical story, in terms of how the Jews understand self-identity, and always many voices within the Jewish heritage itself trying to understand that. But the key to the biblical narrative, which is the first site of the Jewish understanding of peace, is the tension between peace, power, and order, nationalism, my people, and then, of course, God is brought into that, so you have a theocracy. Or is there another understanding, interpretation of God that is about just peace, not just power and peace? And the prophets are constantly, whether the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, or the minor 12, or the oral ones, they're always calling the leaders of states to be just in their quest for peace, and that when power replaces justice, you get totalitarianism. But then justice itself without peace, which we are seeing played out constantly on the streets these days, justice without peace can lead to a very aggressive form of confrontationalism, in which whether it's social justice warriors, they use the language of justice, but the way they're dealing with this is not very peaceful, either internally or how they're acting externally in regards to other the means they use and their concerns, and then the ends they hope to attain. So the language of justice without peace can lead to horrendous consequences, as we're seeing, as I mentioned, at a popular level played out, but also leads in some of the great totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. Justice is central to, obviously, Marxist thought and elements of liberal democracy, of the leftist version of it also. So these key themes, peace, justice, order, power, these are played out. It's the subterranean themes that are being at work in the historic drama of the Hebrew canon. Now I'll move on quickly, because the Hebrew canon itself, you can do a BA, obviously, in not only the Genesis to Malachi, but the Apocrypha, what we call the intertestamental period from Malachi to the coming of Christ, and that, of course, deals with the Jews trying to make sense of occupation by Rome first under Alexander the Great, then the Roman Empire itself. That itself, again, learning the language Hebrew and stuff is very important. And as I said, you'll have obviously people coming to Jewish tradition. This is very important for them if they're sacred, if they're committed to the religious side of Judaism. When you get to the end of the Hebrew canon, which is foundational for the Orthodox Jews, at least, and again, the Orthodox Jews split on how you interpret that in, for example, a contemporary sense in Israel, is the right-wing Orthodox Jews drawing from elements of the military side of the Bible, going into Canaan, the Joshua story, the military, Solomon, David. These stories, Saul, is that God works very closely with those who are willing to use violence to throw out those who they think do not belong there. The land is promised to the Jews. You have other people there, in this case the Palestinians or the Canaanites, whatever. The story remains, the script is the same. It's just the actors who come on stage are a little different in that story. But on the other hand, you have the dovish Orthodox who are going to argue that to use violence, military in any way, it distorts the fact that only the Messiah will bring in the peaceful, the just kingdom. And so the text, the foundation text, even within the Jews who are very committed to religious background, the Orthodox, one can go in a hawkish direction, the other in a dovish direction. And they'll use the same text. One will read the military side. God is with them. They bring all the stories forward, the Maccabees, whatever, the Zealots who Jesus encountered. The doves will draw a more peaceful tradition, a prophetic wing. So you get the nationalist prophetic very, very much at work. Second thing I'll jump over very quickly. Obviously, when the Jews had to flee what today we call Israel, Palestine, when there was a variety of rebellions in Masada, they were finally wiped. Obviously, Masada, if anyone goes to Israel today, this is one of their great icons of fighting to the end. It's the Samson story in many ways. And again, these myths are important to understand in terms of a people's history. We may ask ourselves, so who cares? This is Middle East. It doesn't affect us. Well, in fact, the issue of Israel, Palestinians, Middle East, First World support of Israel, to understand what's going on today, essential to understand what has gone on before, to interpret the various positions, both Jews and Christians, and then foreign policy that is being made in the Middle East and the implications of that for the Middle East. But for really a couple of thousand years, if we can see, the second phase is one in which the Jews were dispersed. Again, like in Egypt, they were marginalized, they were in ghettos, they were rejected, they knew oppression, they knew marginalization. And so you get this return to the Egyptian experience and the sense of powerlessness, victimization, and so they cluster together in small little ethnic communities. Some tried to assimilate into the general European ethos. Some did it well, most didn't, but they certainly knew persecution, and anti-Semitism was a part of that. I might also add, though, significant elements. Sometimes it's played up that the West has been historically anti-Semitic, but there's a very strong streak of philo-Semitism as well, particularly in the Anglo-German or German tradition. So this anti-Semitic, philo-Semitic tradition is part certainly of the Western tradition. But the Jews, as I mentioned, knew oppression, they knew marginalization, yet once again. So it's a repeating of the Egyptian experience. And so it's back to suffering as a people, marginalization, victimization, scapegoating. And you get in, of course, Shakespeare, someone like Shylock, he wants his pound of flesh, justice, 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 and then fair Portia with her understanding of mercy. And of course, you get these two elements in the Jewish tradition, a certain notion of justice, a layered notion of justice, as well as mercy, of course. So this is where you get the prophetic tradition with the strong elements of mercy and justice, and then you can get justice and certain narrow understanding of retributive justice that leads to nationalism to those who dare to challenge us as a people. But by the 19th century, so again, I'm moving very quickly over 2,000 years. here, or 1900 years of history. But the underlying theme here is, for the most part, the Jews understood marginalization. And so there's the longing for how do we protect ourselves as a people from marginalization, pogroms, discrimination, anti-Semitism, all these legitimate historic concerns of which many Jews had suffered under a certain interpretation of Christianity. Obviously, there are many forms of Christianity that were not anti-Semitic, and there's significant elements that were philo-Semitic. So people who read that tradition in a very simplistic way inevitably distort a much more complex historic reality. But by the 19th century, I mentioned earlier, Theodor Herzl begins the process, and many come alongside of him with the rise of Christian Zionism. And Herzl and many others, you get the Balfour Declaration of 1917, and gradually, the Holocaust, obviously what was happening, and there were pogroms in Russia and other parts of Europe also, but it reached an extreme pitch in Germany under the Holocaust. And so this was sort of Egypt on steroids in that sense, the Holocaust, and quite legitimately so. The Jewish people were raising the question, where can we go so we're not going to be victims once again? And so the cry for a homeland. And where was the homeland? Well, they recalled what they saw verses from the Bible, promises that had not been fulfilled. And so you get this merging of Christian Zionism, a fairly right-wing form of Christianity that uncritically supported the Jewish return to the homeland. Remember, part of that Jewish story, we're called, part of the calling is land. The prophetic tradition says land is always subordinate to ethics and justice. A certain nationalist just says, in fact, power is the important thing, a prophetic calling, regardless of how we treat the other. You don't find that position in prophetic Judaism. And so even modern Jews struggle, both religious and secular, between this peace and power, and justice and peace and power, how they come together. But anyway, by 1948, the State of Israel is formed, and you can see these same biblical motifs played out that go back to Egypt, their founding genetic code in that sense. We have been oppressed, the never again theme. Look at what's happened to us for 2,000 years. Therefore, we must have the power, just as we went into Canaan at one time and marginalized others. We know marginalization, so rather than us saying we know it, so we'll identify with the marginalized, no, now we have the power, we will marginalize others. And this is, in one sense, the Exodus Joshua story that was played out back then is being rerun again in terms of Israel and the Palestinians today. But the Jewish people are obviously a homogeneous people. There is, both within the religious Jewish tradition and the secular Jewish tradition, the sense that justice is important, and justice as it's played out in Israel and the Palestinians is the terrible treatment of both Muslim and Christian Palestinians in East Jerusalem, West Bank, obviously Gaza, the Palestinian refugee camps. And so the Jewish people, when it comes to peace, are very divided between telling a story of oppression, therefore we need the power to prevent us from being oppressed again, but we oppress other people in the process. Or, yes, we have been oppressed, therefore we are not going to oppress others, i.e., in this case, the Palestinians or Muslims or Christians. And so when it comes to peacemaking within the Jewish tradition, they're divided very much, both the religious Jews as well as the secular Jews, and many of the Jews are in diaspora, of course, New York and Canada. Montreal is a very large Jewish community as well. Is how are they to see Israel today? Is it to be peace, power, never again, Holocaust, therefore we have to have a strong military that aligns with the United States and Canada to be our support in the Middle East as we're surrounded by what are seen threatening enemies? Do we make alliances with some of these threatening enemies, as the Jews did in the biblical phase? And so the themes when it comes to shalom, then, which is the the Hebrew word for peace, is peace purchased at the price of power? And do we use God's name to create injustice? Or is justice the very thing that defines the meaning of peace? And so it is in this tension, as played out in their history and played out in contemporary Israel and the diasporic Jews, that very much defines the Jewish attempt to understand shalom and what it means in their history and how they mine that history, complex as it is, conflicting voices as it is, for contemporary situations in Israel and elsewhere.